The following contains spoilers for The Last of Us. You have been warned. Greetings, fellow mortals. Morality can be a difficult concept to comprehend. Every day, we all struggle to do what we think is the right thing. We struggle to come to terms with people who have a different set of values than us, and we try to find the line that we believe can never be crossed. For the most part, a lot of the biggest ethical questions have already been solved. Don't cheat on your significant other. Don't steal other people's property. Don't assault people. Don't murder. Because, in general, modern society has become more ethical than before and will only grow to be safer and more moral as time goes on. You know, as long as World War III doesn't break out. That's why people in the safest positions humanity has ever been in amuse each other with theoretical situations. Fiction, stories, tales we tell each other to break up the mundane feelings we have in modern society. And these concepts are fun for the most part. Little what ifs are an entertaining way to pass the time. Would you steal to feed yourself? Would you kill to save a life? Would you ruin your own reputation if it meant making the world a better place? Those concepts are fun to think about, especially if you bring different schools of thought into these experiments. Utilitarianism is ethics by the numbers. How much good does this act do compared to evil? Deontology is morality based on a code, when you follow a creed to the letter. Consequentialism is goodness based on the outcome. The ends justify the means. These are basic schools of thought, and there's a lot more than just these three. And none of them cover every possible scenario. That's the thing about morality. No one thought process works perfectly, especially when it comes to apocalypse stories. After all, the great thinkers rarely took into account if every aspect of governable society fell apart. But that's what makes thinking about all this so fun, even if the practical application is horrifying. As with you saw with the title of the video, my goal is to argue that Joel is the most moral character in The Last of Us. Compared to everyone else, he's a hero, from start to finish. Not to say that he would fit in with our normal standards of today, but in this alternate universe, no one beats him. He may be grumpy, gruff, and sad, but his actions are the most moral things that could be done during the course of the Last of Us story. Yes, even at the end, I'll get to that, but for now, let's focus at the beginning. P.S. I won't be taking into account anything that wasn't shown in the game. We're only told a few implications of what happened between Sarah's death and Joel's journey with Ellie. Tommy may be upset about everything that happened, but we don't know the context or the full story, so there's no point in arguing over that. Instead, let's focus on what we see during the game. And of course, killing zombies never counts as immoral, so all of those kills don't count. From the start, it's shown that Joel does not tend to start conflict with human enemies. He wanted to avoid it whenever possible. Now, you could argue that there were times that he went for the kill when it wasn't necessary, but this is a world that's 20 years into the apocalypse. Joel has 2 decades of experience in a world where one wrong step could lead to his death. And fights aren't actually like what you see in the movies or in the less realistic video games. You can't hold back when someone else is trying to kill you. So Joel is acting in self-defense every time that he couldn't avoid a conflict. Now, the events with Robert are probably the least cut and dry out of everything in The Last of Us, at least in my mind. Robert was a black market dealer who apparently managed to cheat everyone that worked with him. That means that this man was doomed. There was no way that he wasn't going to be tracked down eventually by someone. Now, you could argue that Tess and Joel could have waited until the goons that Robert hired figured out that he couldn't pay them, but then they wouldn't have gotten their goods one way or another. This is where the ethical systems that I mentioned earlier come into play. Killing all of Robert's goons to get their goods doesn't work out by the numbers, I'll admit that. Tess and Joel killed a lot of people who could have had families and loved ones. Of course, we could argue that Tess and Joel were focusing on the people around them. They cared about themselves, the people who honored their deals, and the clients who might have used the weapons cache to save lives. That's why the numbers game rarely works out if you think about the grand scheme of everything. A code of rules could make Tess and Joel's actions more acceptable in the Last of Us world. Robert didn't honor any of his deals and did try to get our protagonist killed. If Joel and Tess let him go in any way, it could have hurt their reputations. And in their city, it seems like their reputations is everything. And all of this is at the best case scenario. At worst, Robert would eventually try to get revenge. But that does get into consequentialism, which has a giant problem with speculation, just like deontology has a problem with not allowing for a lot of gray areas. That's one of the many reasons why following a single thought process in ethics is wrong. From my perspective, Robert tried to scam everyone in a world where that's definitely going to get you killed. His men had to have known what type of boss they were following, meaning they probably weren't the best people in the world, or they were completely desperate. Perhaps they should have wondered why people with a reputation of wanting to be left alone were so gung-ho about getting to Robert. In a world filled with zombies, bandits, and insane organizations, I don't think that Tess and Joel acted too harshly by breaking Robert's arm and giving him a quick death. They definitely could have been a lot crueler. Like I said earlier, the start of the game is actually the most morally iffy. I have to justify a lot, but in terms of people who were the most ethical, I would say that Joel and Tess were at least above Robert and his men, especially because they were willing to work for the weapons that the Fireflies had, and they had to have a decent reputation if Marlene was willing to trust them with Ellie to begin with. Thus, we get to the heart of the matter. As soon as Joel started traveling with Ellie, his actions became a lot more cut and dry. Like I said earlier, killing zombies is always a moral good in this universe. That leaves the various human enemies that Joel had to deal with. The fascist government soldiers were trying to mow down innocent people and stop the cure for the fungus. Joel just wanted to get away from them. They were determined to kill him and a little girl. As such, I would say that he acted completely in self-defense and life defense when dealing with the government militia. I could say the same thing about his interactions with bandits. Joel didn't want to fight the majority of the men that attacked him and Ellie. Those people were determined to kill him and get their hands on Ellie. Considering that most of the bandits were shown to be rapists, torturers, and murderers, I don't think that Joel did anything wrong by killing them to protect himself and Ellie. You could argue that there were times where players were given a little bit of choice about if they wanted to sneak around a group of men without fighting, but I think first playthroughs had most players try to avoid such fights if possible. A lot of these men were shown to try to track Joel to an insane degree. He didn't have a whole lot of choices. Of course, Joel was shown to have experience in such matters. It was stated that he had been a part of both sides of ambushes throughout his life. Like I said earlier, we don't know the full circumstances of these instances. Also, we don't know the circumstances of Joel's experience with torture. He was shown to be able to get information out of a man fast. Both times it was done to save Ellie, and the first one was at least a bandit who kidnapped Ellie and probably intended to make her David's plaything, kill her, or even eat her. And I suppose that leads to the second instance of torture. I will say this, the Fireflies are full of fools and psychopaths. Let's start off when Joel was trying to give CPR to Ellie. Their response was to knock him out instead of restraining him, holding him at gunpoint, and helping Ellie. You know, like reasonable people. Also, Marlene probably gave a description of both Joel and Ellie to her men. Shouldn't they have known to be more cautious when it involved a graying man and a teenage girl that fit the descriptions of the people that their boss desperately wanted to save? My assumption was always that Marlene was a terrible leader. After all, she could barely control her men, and she listened to the worst doctor on the planet. Abby's father was either a sociopath that wanted to kill a little girl or the dumbest physician ever to practice. His first instinct, only a few hours after getting the cure for the fungus, was to kill the only person who had ever been immune. I repeat, it was a few hours. He went all in on the fact that killing Ellie and taking her brain would create a vaccine, which is not how it works. Did they even try to use some of her blood or run real tests or try anything other than murdering a little girl and destroying the source of the possible vaccine? Considering that the Fireflies were full of morons and malicious people, I don't blame Joel for what happened. When I first played the final level of The Last of Us, I was muttering about how stupid these people were, and I was 17 when I first played this game. It's not hard to know that killing the immune person is a terrible idea. I was angry that they would kill Ellie and destroy the cure for humanity. I had a very different reaction to everyone else who seemed to play this game. No one was spared with me, and I think Joel was justified to kill anyone trying to stop him. Now, you could argue that Joel was only acting selfishly. He didn't know that the Fireflies had the stupidest doctor to ever practice. All he cared about was saving his adopted daughter, which is a fair argument if we look at ethics solely on intent. But if we think about the possible consequences of his actions, we come out with a different result. By fighting the Fireflies, he saved the cure for humanity, which means that he beat the numbers game automatically. Joel's sole focus was on his code of saving his adopted daughter and the cure for humanity, so I think that he clears there. And the consequences were perfect because the Fireflies were terrible and Ellie got to live. Thus, Joel was perfectly moral to do what he did. Honestly, I didn't feel bad at all at the end of the story. I think that Joel should have at least been more honest with Ellie, and I think that Ellie would have accepted him saying that he cared about her too much to let her die. And I thought that's what Naughty Dog was going for. Of course, I was wrong. Part 2 proved that, but considering the change in leadership, the shifting writing quality makes sense. Of course, Part 2 deserves its own video. As you can see, I don't think that Joel did anything wrong in The Last of Us. In the grand scheme of things, he was the most moral adult character. His actions were the best possible in a world where ethics had already died. Joel may have been grumpy, tired, and sad, but that was because of everything that he had lost. Ellie brought new light into his world, and I think their journey together is beautiful. It was Joel's redemption after years of simply doing everything possible to survive. Because that's one of the many things that I took from The Last of Us. Humanity has evolved to the point where we can't just survive. We want to actually live our lives in some way. And there's nothing more human than taking care of the people that we love. I think that's the highest morality that we can achieve. And eventually, that love can bleed out to the people outside of our core groups. That's the beauty of the safe world that we live in, and I hope that people continue to embrace such an ethical mindset. Thank you so much for watching. If you like my takes on storytelling, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It would really help me out. Also, remember that I'll be self-publishing my novel, Dance of Frozen Death, at the start of 2023. I hope that you will check it out. I appreciate you. Do not despair.